Jim and I had just finished our day shift at the plant. We were driving back home together in my car. We always commuted together whenever our work shifts coincided. This week, it was my turn to use my car. As soon as we left the plant, Jim asked me to stop at a pharmacy on our way back home so he could fill a prescription. His wife, Sally, had a bad cold, and the doctor had prescribed medication to treat her stubborn cold. Since we were driving near the pharmacy where my wife, Rachel, worked, I decided to surprise both Jim and Rachel by stopping there. During all the years Rachel had worked there, I had never once visited her at her workplace. I figured she would be very surprised to see me. I had never dared to visit her at the pharmacy because I didn't want her coworkers or her boss to think I was checking up on her. Surprisingly, she never commented on this. She was working that day, and I knew she would indeed be surprised to see me. Rachel only worked at the pharmacy 2 days a week. I thought it was time I finally met her boss after 6 years. Rachel and I had been married for 9 years. Even though we weren't wealthy, I earned a good salary at the plant. I preferred Rachel to stay at home, but 2 years into our marriage, she expressed a desire to work. She also wanted her own car. She managed to convince me to let her work for a year or two, at least until she could pay for the car she wanted. A week after we agreed on her working, she found a job at a pharmacy on the other side of town. Just over a year later, she gave birth to our daughter, Sandy. For the next 2 years, Rachel was a stay-at-home mom. When Sandy was older, Rachel once again expressed a desire to work, even if it was only a couple of days a week. She mentioned that she had already spoken to the pharmacy where she had previously worked, and Mr. Clarkson was willing to rehire her, even if it was just for 2 days a week. I finally agreed. She arranged for her mother to take care of Sandy on the days she worked. Rachel had now been working 2 days a week for Mr. Clarkson for over 3 years. Sandy was almost 6, and not once had I never stepped inside her place of work before. I parked in front of the pharmacy, and both Jim and I went inside. It wasn't a huge place, but it had everything one would expect in a pharmacy. There were 4 long aisles, on each side of which were shelves loaded with everything from cough syrup to all brands of other products. At the very back was the space where prescriptions were filled. Jim and I immediately walked there, but instead of seeing Rachel as I expected, there was only a middle-aged man behind the long counter. He took Jim's prescription and started working on it. I was about to introduce myself and ask him where my wife was, but with Jim standing next to me, I didn't want him to know that I was unaware of her absence, so I remained silent. While the pharmacist was busy with the prescription, Jim wandered further away, looking at the different displays. That's when I decided to inspect the back of the place more closely. As soon as I looked over the counter behind the pharmacist, my eyes landed on a desk near the wall. On it rested a framed picture of a girl around 7 or 8 years old. What struck me about the picture was the uncanny resemblance the child bore to my Sandy. She had the same long blonde hair, blue eyes, and even her smile was identical. I stood there in awe examining the picture. The resemblance to my daughter was so striking that it felt like I was seeing how Sandy might look in a year or so. Confused, I asked the pharmacist, who was still busy counting pills, if the child in the picture was his daughter. "No, I have only 2 boys at home. This is Kathy. She's the daughter of Mr. Clarkson. She's a lovely child, isn't she?" "Yes, she certainly is," I replied, too shocked to say more. I moved away, pretending to browse an item on a nearby shelf. Deep down, I felt a sinking sensation. How could this Kathy look so much like my own daughter? And where was Rachel? A sense of dread grew within me. I had an inkling about the answers to both questions but wasn't ready to confront them. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming need to leave. I approached Jim and told him I'd wait for him in the car. I sat there waiting. A troubling thought crossed my mind. Sandy looked nothing like Rachel, and she certainly didn't have any of my facial features. Both Rachel and I had brown eyes and dark brown hair, yet Sandy was blonde. When she was a young child, many of my friends joked about the color of her hair. Some even teased, asking if we ordered pizza often or inquiring about the hair color of our mailman. Of course, these were just friendly jests, and I never let these remarks bother me. But now they came back to haunt me. Was Sandy really my daughter, or was she Mr. Clarkson's child? The strange thing was that I had never met or seen Carl Clarkson, so I had no idea what he looked like, except that he had light-colored hair. Rachel had mentioned this detail a few times. Later that evening at home, Rachel noticed my quiet and pensive mood. She asked if something was bothering me. I didn't tell her about my visit to her workplace or my troubling thoughts. I would have liked to know where she was when I stopped by, but I kept my concerns to myself. I knew I had to tread carefully and not accuse her based on mere suspicions. More importantly, I needed proof to either confirm or dispel my doubts about Sandy's parentage. The mere thought that my beloved daughter might not be biologically mine was excruciating. I loved Sandy more than anyone else in the world and would do anything for her. I tried to convince myself that the resemblance between the two girls was just a coincidence, but deep down, suspicion kept resurfacing. Later that night, lying next to Rachel, the full weight of the day's events bore down on me. If Sandy wasn't my daughter and if Carl Clarkson was her biological father, it meant Rachel had been deceiving me since she first started working for him over 6 years ago. I wondered if she was still continuing her affair. She had likely been making a fool out of me all those years, returning home after being with him, perhaps secretly relishing the fact that she had deceived me. I recalled how she always took a shower as soon as she got home, explaining that she needed to wash off the chemicals she came into contact with. Now, I suspected she was washing away evidence of her infidelity. The next day was Friday. Since Rachel wasn't working, after dropping Jim off at his house, I drove to her workplace. I wanted to see Carl Clarkson face to face. Given that he didn't know me and I had never seen him, I felt it was time that I was eager to finally see him. After asking the woman at the cash register about Mr. Clarkson's whereabouts, she informed me that he had already left for the day. However, she mentioned that Mr. Mann, his assistant, could assist with my prescription. She gestured towards the back, indicating the same man who had filled Jim's prescription the day before. I informed her that I'd return another day since my business was personal with Mr. Clarkson. She then surprised me by mentioning that I should avoid coming on Tuesday or Thursday afternoons, as Mr. Clarkson was never at the pharmacy during those times. I left without further comment, nodding to show I'd understood. Sitting in my car, I tried to piece things together. Rachel had been hired to assist Mr. Clarkson on those exact days. She was meant to help him with prescriptions. Yet, she always referred to him formally as Mr. Clarkson, and now I'd learned he wasn't even present on the days she worked. It didn't add up. What was Rachel doing on those afternoons? She wasn't at the pharmacy the previous day when she should have been working. Could she have been elsewhere with him? After Sandy's birth, I had been against Rachel returning to work. But she was persistent and I eventually relented. Now, doubts about her job and that unsettling photograph of the child on the desk plagued my thoughts. My trust in Rachel's fidelity was waning. Was she involved with her boss, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I hoped to find proof of her actions. Let's see what evidence I could uncover. That weekend at home with Rachel was torturous. Every glance at her conjured images of her with her boss, though I couldn't put a face to him since I hadn't met him. Deep down, I feared Sandy might be his child. Was he still seeing my wife behind my back? Could they be planning for a second child together? All these years, had she been with him more frequently than with me? My anger bubbled beneath the surface. I knew that every time I looked at her, I'd be consumed by these doubts until I found evidence to the contrary. One morning, as she slept beside me, I quietly observed her. She was indeed a beautiful woman, but the thought of her possibly going behind my back was disheartening. We barely spoke until noon that day, and during lunch, my conversation was mostly directed at our daughter. That night, I woke her in the middle of the night to be intimate. There was no affection, no tenderness, just raw emotion. It was my way of seeking revenge for what I believed she had given to another man, something I felt was exclusively mine. Strangely, Rachel never protested my behavior, which, in itself, seemed to confirm my suspicions. She had something to hide and was perhaps trying to appease me by being submissive. Despite my growing conviction, I had no concrete evidence of her infidelity. I couldn't even fathom why I was behaving so erratically. All I knew was that I harbored a deep-seated desire to hurt her. Her silence and compliance, I believed, stemmed from fear. But why would she fear me, her husband, unless she had something to conceal? She seemed eager to move past my bouts of anger and resume our daily routines. I sensed she was wary of confronting the issue, fearful that I might have uncovered her secret. She seemed to be buying peace by enduring my treatment. As days passed, my conviction that she was involved with her boss deepened. I, who had always been a gentle and caring husband, now treated her with indifference. I used her without any regard for her feelings. My resentment overshadowed the love and respect I once had for her. I believed I was exacting some form of revenge, and the more I persisted, the more I noticed apprehension in her demeanor. One evening, as we sat silently at the kitchen table, I could sense her unease. She seemed to suspect that I was onto her secret affair with this man. Why she was so fearful, I couldn't pinpoint. I had never been violent. Was she trying to maintain the stability of our marriage while also indulging in the thrill of an affair? Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to take the upcoming Tuesday off and follow her to work. I was fairly certain they weren't meeting at the pharmacy, so they must have been rendezvousing elsewhere. I planned to borrow Jim's truck that day, allowing me to tail her discreetly. On Tuesday morning, I dressed in my usual work clothes and drove to pick up Jim at his house. Once there, I handed him the keys to my car and took off in his truck. I parked the truck a few houses away from mine, positioning it so I could easily observe my home. About half an hour later, I saw Rachel get into her car with Sandy. I discreetly followed them to Sandy's school, where she dropped our daughter off. Rachel then drove straight to the pharmacy. I parked Jim's truck across the street and settled in to wait, radio playing softly in the background. I wasn't sure what I expected to see, but I felt certain something would transpire. From my vantage point, I could see her red Toyota and most of the parking spaces adjacent to the pharmacy. I was prepared to stake out the location all day if necessary. However, barely 30 minutes after Rachel entered the pharmacy, a black SUV pulled into the lot. The driver parked next to Rachel's car. A tall, well-dressed man, around 35, exited the vehicle and entered the pharmacy using a key on a private door adjacent to the parking area. The moment I saw him, I felt certain he was the father of the girl in the framed picture. A sinking realization hit me: this man might also be Sandy's biological father. This was the man who had been deceiving me for the past 6 years. A surge of anger welled up within me. I wanted to confront him, to unleash my fury on both him and Rachel. But the time for such confrontations had passed. If I had discovered their affair early on, perhaps our marriage could have weathered the storm. But after potentially 6 years of deceit, with them possibly meeting twice a week, the damage was irreparable. Now, my focus shifted to retribution. I continued my vigil in Jim's truck until noon. Suddenly, the same door swung open, and both Rachel and the man emerged, smiles on their faces. To an outsider, they appeared to be a contented couple. They climbed into his SUV and drove off. Following the black SUV was easy, as the man didn't seem to be in a rush. 15 minutes later, they were on a country road leading to the lake. Another 10 minutes, and they turned into the driveway of a picturesque log cottage by the lake's edge. I parked Jim's truck half a mile down the road and then walked back towards the cottage. It was surrounded by a tall, well-trimmed cedar hedge on all sides except the one facing the lake. This hedge would provide ample cover, ensuring the neighbors wouldn't spot me. I cautiously circled the house until I heard noises emanating from an open window on the cottage's left side. Quietly approaching the partially opened window, which reached up to my shoulders, I peered inside. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dimness, but soon I discerned the figures of a man and a woman on a bed. They were both unclothed and clearly intimate. Studying his face, I recognized features that mirrored Sandy's: the delicate nose, the hair color, and the hue of his eyes. Any lingering doubts evaporated. Carl Clarkson was undoubtedly Sandy's biological father. For years, my wife had duped me into believing I was Sandy's father, making me the butt of their private joke. They must have seen me as the ultimate fool, raising another man's child. And for all I knew, they might be planning for another child at that very moment. Despite the revelations, my love for Sandy remained unwavering. She was my daughter in every way that mattered. But witnessing my wife with another man was heart-wrenching. It's an experience I wouldn't wish on any husband. The scene evoked a tumult of emotions: anger, sadness, and, confusingly, a hint of arousal. Tears blurred my vision, and self-pity consumed me, further fueling my resentment towards them. I wished I had brought a camera to capture evidence of her infidelity. I was now resolved to file for divorce and needed compelling proof of her betrayal to present in court, especially if I hoped to gain custody of Sandy. Unable to bear the sight or sounds any longer, I retreated quietly. Rachel returned home at her usual time after work that day. As was her routine, she headed straight for the shower. Meanwhile, I continued preparing supper for the family, as I typically did on those days. While she worked, our conversations were minimal, but we both listened intently to Sandy as she recounted her day at school. The next morning, a Wednesday when Rachel wasn't working, she sat at the breakfast table in her gown with Sandy and me. Occasionally, I caught her stealing glances at me when she thought I was engrossed in my meal. Her expression was peculiar, suggesting she might suspect that I was onto her affair with her boss. I even discerned a hint of fear in her gaze. That evening, as she tidied up the kitchen, I shared a fabricated story about a coworker who had caught his wife in an affair the previous week. I mentioned how he had severely beaten her upon discovering her infidelity and that his friends at the plant were plotting revenge on her lover. After listening intently, she looked at me wide-eyed and asked if I believed that was the right course of action. I responded that a wife shouldn't cheat on her husband and that both the wife and her lover deserved to face consequences for their betrayal. The following Tuesday, I took the afternoon off and borrowed Jim's truck again. After a quick lunch in the truck, I drove to the lakeside cottage. As expected, Carl's black SUV was parked in the driveway. This time, I was armed with a video camera ready to capture evidence of their affair. I needed this proof not only to bolster my case for Sandy's custody but also to expose Carl to his wife. I wanted him to suffer the consequences of his actions. For a moment, I considered conducting a DNA test on Sandy and myself to establish paternity. However, I realized that even if the test confirmed I wasn't Sandy's biological father, it could backfire in court, potentially granting Rachel more leverage in a custody battle. Instead, I chose to feign ignorance about Sandy's parentage, hoping the video evidence would suffice. They were once again on the bed, much like the previous time I'd observed them, but now I captured every moment on film. During their conversation, I overheard Carl mention that he was ensuring his wife would never obtain a driving permit, presumably to prevent her from tracking him. Rachel confided in him about my recent odd behavior, expressing her growing fear that I might be onto their secret. It was evident that this revelation unnerved Carl. When I believed I had captured enough incriminating footage of the unfaithful pair, I drove home to prepare supper, as I typically did when she worked. She usually finished work at 6 and arrived home about 15 minutes later. So, I deduced that on her workdays, she and Carl were likely intimate from 2:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. That evening, I decided to capitalize on the evident fear they both seemed to harbor towards me. While I'm not a violent man, the fabricated story I'd shared about the coworker who had assaulted his unfaithful wife likely unnerved her. This, combined with my recent treatment of her, probably contributed to the fearful image she now held of me. I surmised she was biding her time, perhaps hoping for a divorce, freeing her to be with Carl. On Wednesday, the same week I filmed them, I broached the topic of the vengeful coworker during supper. I embellished the tale, saying the adulterous man was now hospitalized. He got what he deserved, I remarked, further stoking her anxiety. I added that the wronged husband was filing for divorce and seeking custody of his children. Rachel's shock was palpable, her hands trembling as she ate. The next day, when she returned from her afternoon rendezvous, her nervousness was evident. During supper, I began inquiring about her work, her boss, his appearance, his family, details I'd never shown interest in before. My sudden curiosity clearly unsettled her. To further instill doubt and fear, I mentioned casually that I might visit her at work someday. Her visible shock was met with silence, and she simply nodded in response. That weekend, I took her and Sandy out to eat. Though we tried to maintain the facade of a loving family, even Sandy sensed the change in her mother. She now gravitated towards me, seeking affection and answers. At the restaurant, when Sandy excused herself to the restroom, I seized the opportunity to address Rachel's evident distress. "Is something bothering you? Do you want to talk about it?" I asked. "Roger, I don't know what's come over you these past weeks, but you're not making love to me anymore. When was the last time?" She looked at me, concern evident in her eyes. It was clear she felt some remorse, but it was equally clear she wasn't ready to confess. Even if she had admitted her infidelity and sought forgiveness, it was far too late for reconciliation. The damage to our marriage, to me, and to Sandy was irreparable. I love you, Roger, but lately, I don't see love in your eyes when you look at me. You've been hating me, I said. Tell me, Rachel, are you cheating on me? If you are, then we, as a couple, are over and you will never see our daughter again. I can guarantee you that. I had finally said it, the cat was out of the bag. She looked at me for a long moment, too stunned to respond. As we stared at each other, I could see tears forming in her eyes. Suddenly, she grabbed her purse and ran out of the restaurant. I paid the bill and waited for Sandy to come out of the washroom. When we got outside, Rachel was there waiting for us. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying anymore. The following Monday, I approached my boss and requested 2 weeks off. He was initially hesitant, but when I explained that I was dealing with a family crisis, he relented. That afternoon, I drove to Carl's house. Once parked outside, I sat for several minutes, contemplating my next move. I wasn't sure of my intentions, but I felt it was time to meet his wife and inform her of the situation. I could see her in the backyard near the pool. She appeared taller than Rachel and had light brown hair, similar to my wife's. Gathering my courage, I exited my car and, after opening the fence door, approached her in the backyard. She was rearranging chairs around the pool. Once I was in front of her, I introduced myself. I'm Roger Weldon. My wife, Rachel, works for your husband at the pharmacy. She gave me a curious look, then smiled and extended her hand. Of course, I've heard of Rachel. I've never met her, but my husband has mentioned her a few times. I'm Claudine Clarkson. She had a warm smile, and from our brief interaction, I could tell she had a pleasant personality. It dawned on me that she was likely unaware of her husband's affair with my wife. Of course, what I was about to reveal would be devastating, but it was unavoidable. She deserved to know the truth. I decided to be direct, as this wasn't a social visit. Mrs. Clarkson, what I'm about to share will cause you great pain, but you need to know. I believe your husband and my wife have been having an affair for several years. She stared at me speechless, her mouth slightly open. After a few moments, tears began to form in her eyes. She covered her mouth with both hands in shock. Before I could continue, she managed to ask, "Do you have proof?" Yes, I have evidence of their affair. I've taken photos of them together at your cottage by the lake. And there's more. Their affair has spanned over 6 years, and I'm almost certain that your husband is the biological father of my daughter. She suddenly broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. I guided her inside the house and helped her sit on the couch. After she had calmed down slightly, I took out a photo of my daughter, Sandy, from my wallet and handed it to her. This is Sandy. Notice the striking resemblance to your husband? The blonde hair, the slim nose, the high cheekbones. In fact, she looks a lot like your own daughter. I noticed a picture of her daughter on the fireplace mantel. Picking it up, I placed both photos side by side on the coffee table. Look at the resemblance, Mrs. Clarkson. They could be mistaken for twins. We don't need a DNA test to see they're related. It's evident they're sisters. By now, Claudine had stopped crying. She held both pictures, studying them intently. Finally, she looked up at me, her voice filled with desperation. What are we going to do? I'm not sure about you, but I'm divorcing my wife, and I intend to seek custody of my daughter. She nodded slowly. I've had suspicions about Carl for a while now. I suppose this is the only fair solution for you. After all, I'm the one who does the laundry. He will pay for what he's done. Mrs. Clarkson, if you'd like, I can provide you with copies of the photos I have of them together. However, we should wait a few days before revealing that we know about their affair. I'll explain why. I then retrieved the tape from my car, and we watched a portion of it together. My wife was intimately involved with her husband. Claudine cried again, and after a few moments, she pleaded with me to stop the playback. Once she had regained some composure, I detailed my intentions. At my urging, she agreed to delay confronting her husband about leaving him. On Tuesday, I consulted my attorney. He informed me that even with the evidence of my wife's infidelity, gaining custody of Sandy would be challenging, especially if I wasn't her biological father. He explained that my wife could simply request a DNA test on Sandy to prove I wasn't the father. He added that if she used this argument in court, I could sue Carl for years of child support, but I'd likely lose custody of Sandy. I didn't want that outcome, so I instructed him to halt proceedings. I needed to devise a strategy to compel her to leave temporarily, ensuring she'd forfeit her custody rights. No DNA tests had been conducted yet, and a mother who abandoned her child for a tryst would not fare well in court. When Rachel returned from work, I saw evidence of her infidelity. Her lips were glistening. Recognizing that her secret was out, she broke down, pleading for my forgiveness. She tried to engage me in conversation, repeatedly expressing her remorse. I remained silent. Eventually, she declared her intention to end the affair with Carl and resign from her job. She professed her love for only me and promised to make amends. It was evident she was being insincere. Having overheard her conversation with Carl at the cottage, I knew she had no plans to leave him. She was merely stalling. It was clear she intended to depart with Carl, with Sandy and her apprehension about my potential response being the only obstacles. I realized that if I wanted to compel her to run away with her boss, I needed to amplify the fear she already felt. She had to be genuinely concerned for her safety and that of her lover. Thus, in a measured tone, I told her I would never forgive her infidelity and that my retribution, aimed at both her and Carl, would be severe. Notably, I refrained from mentioning my suspicions about Sandy's paternity. Later that afternoon, I visited Claudine's residence. At my suggestion, she had engaged the same attorney I had consulted. She informed me that he had already made significant progress with the divorce paperwork for both of us. She also mentioned that her husband's behavior had been peculiar over the past day. She had observed him loading boxes into his SUV when he believed she was occupied elsewhere. She was fairly certain he was plotting to leave her. I emphasized to her that this would be advantageous, as his abandonment would likely grant her automatic custody of their daughter. In such a scenario, he would be at a significant disadvantage in court. Rachel didn't report to work that Tuesday, claiming she had resigned and had no plans to communicate with Carl in the future. I was indifferent to her assurances. Firstly, I was convinced she was being deceitful, and secondly, I had already resolved not to remain in the marriage much longer. Later that day, I observed her discreetly packing some of her belongings, confirming my suspicion that she intended to leave imminently. However, I was determined not to let her take Sandy. To expedite her growing inclination to flee with her lover, I chose to further stoke her fears. That afternoon, I intimated that I intended to confront Carl soon. When she inquired about the fate of our marriage, I cryptically responded that once I had dealt with her lover, I would decide her fate. The palpable fear in her gaze was evident as she regarded me silently. By nature, I'm not a violent individual. Until these recent events, I had always treated her with kindness, both in our daily interactions and in our intimate moments, but after discovering she had broken our marriage vows over 6 years ago and continued to do so, the love I once felt for her evaporated. I transformed, not into a violent man, but into a sad and angry one. The next day, after dropping Sandy off at school, I spoke with the school's administrator. I explained that my wife might attempt to run away with another man and could potentially try to kidnap Sandy. I emphasized that under no circumstances should Sandy be released to my wife or anyone else. I would personally drop off and pick up Sandy each day. Upon returning home, I suspected that in my absence, Rachel would call Carl. I hoped they would act on their plan to flee together. I wanted her out of my life and him as far away as possible. Serving Rachel with divorce papers was no longer viable, as she might gain custody of Sandy. Instead, I aimed to force her to leave with Carl, leaving Sandy behind. Even if it was just for a few days, I intended to relocate to the other end of the country with my daughter. When I arrived at Claudine's house, she was in tears. Carl had taken most of his clothes and left without informing her of his destination. I surmised he had been waiting for me to leave so he could retrieve Rachel. To ensure they didn't take Sandy, I rushed to her school. Upon arrival, I spotted Carl's car with both him and Rachel inside. They sped off upon seeing me. Sandy was safe inside the school, and I took her home. I later told her that her mother had to visit a sick relative and would be away for some time. The following day, I changed all the locks on the doors and met with my lawyer to inform him that Rachel had abandoned her family to run away with her lover. I then visited a real estate agent to list my house for sale. Since the house was solely in my name, I anticipated no issues with the paperwork. That evening I called Claudine. She was distraught, revealing that Carl had left a note explaining he was leaving her for another woman he had fallen in love with. He also explained in the letter that the previous week he had consulted his lawyer, and both the house and cottage were now solely in her name. He had also left a modest sum of money in the bank for her. I felt deeply sympathetic for Claudine, and in some way, I felt partially responsible for her predicament. I then mentioned to her that my daughter, Sandy, deeply missed her mother's presence, and since I was about to order a large pizza and salad, I invited her and Kathy to join us. Within 15 minutes, Claudine and Kathy were at my house. Inviting them over was one of the best decisions I ever made. Sandy and Kathy got along splendidly, and Kathy's presence somewhat filled the void left by Sandy's mother. As for me, I found Claudine's company both enlightening and comforting. We all enjoyed a delightful evening. From that point, things progressed rapidly. Claudine and I became close friends. She sold her cottage and house and soon after moved in with me. Within weeks, we appeared to outsiders as a married couple with 2 lovely daughters. Once I found a buyer for my house, I suggested to Claudine that we relocate to ensure our former spouses couldn't track us down. Less than a month after Rachel left, Claudine and I settled in Texas with the 2 girls. Over time, I built a beautiful house in a mid-sized town and discovered a lucrative opportunity in house contracting. I pursued this venture and now have a team of 5 working for me. It's been 5 years since Claudine and I moved to Texas. We welcomed a baby boy last year, and to everyone here, we seem like a blissfully married couple with Sandy and Kathy as our daughters. As for Rachel and Carl, we haven't heard from them in all these years, and we hope it remains that way. They must have realized by now that infidelity often comes with consequences. After all, their affair led to them losing touch with their respective daughters. Life is incredibly fulfilling for us now. Thank you for joining our journey, and that's a wrap, folks. Thanks for hanging out with us here today. To catch more awesome narrations, hit that subscribe button, drop a thumbs up, and comment your favorite part. And hey, don't forget to hit that notification bell to be the first to know when we drop the next story.